Good evening and welcome to Against the Odds, Pathways to Peace in East Timor, Aceh and West Papua. My name is Michael Cookson. The talk tonight centres on the recent publication of Anime and Violence, Non-Truth and Reconciliation in Indonesian Peacebuilding. There are copies of the book down here on the table. This book is the first in a series of publications for Peacebuilding Compared, an interdisciplinary research project based here at the ANU and headed by Professor John Braithwaite. The map here shows the first set of case studies in the project, 3 of which will be discussed tonight. I'll leave John to talk more about the project and these cases in a few minutes. And you may read more at your leisure in this book and forthcoming publications. But tonight I'd like to begin by discussing my involvement with the project. I first visited West Papua for research in 1994. What struck me then was the profound sense of both fear and defiance amongst local Papuans towards the Indonesian state. The defiance first came with the precipitous integration of Netherlands New Guinea into Indonesia in 1963 without the involvement or consent of the majority of indigenous West Papuans. The Indonesian response to this defiance from the mid-1960s to the late 1990s, the period of President Suharto's authoritarian New Order regime, was characterised more than anything by repression. Since Indonesia took administrative control of the territory, Papuan political aspirations for an independent state have been brutally repressed. Their traditional claims to land have been denied, their cultural practices frequently regarded with contempt. Hundreds of thousands of migrants from elsewhere in Indonesia have come to the territory seeking economic opportunities often not available to Papuans themselves. Those Papuans who have taken up arms against Indonesia, and many merely suspected of separatist inclinations, have become victims of intimidation, torture, imprisonment, and on occasion, summary execution. This was the pattern of life for Papuans under Suharto's New Order, and it has cast a long shadow over Papua. Since the fall of Suharto, things have improved dramatically across much of Indonesia. Sadly, Papua lags far behind in almost all of the critical reforms that have made life for many other Indonesians better, and many Papuans remain disillusioned with and feel disenfranchised by the Indonesian state. Initiatives by the state since 1998, nominally intended to improve the situation in Papua for Papuans, have often failed to deliver on their promise. They have also transformed the nature of the conflict in the region, introducing and exacerbating forms of horizontal conflict amongst Papuans. Calls by Papuans from within Papua for a transformation in their thinking to create a new Papua built on a clearer vision of the future and a clearer sense of common ideals have largely fallen flat. And the outcome of efforts to promote peace in the province and to promote dialogue between Papuans and the Indonesian state, while ongoing, remain far from certain. Papua appears to be at an impasse. To an area specialist such as me, the picture today looks pretty bleak. And this is where the Peacebuilding Compared project comes in. I was invited to join the project for this first volume, and what I learnt during this work has helped me transform my rather cynical perspective on the situation in Papua. As I said earlier, you can read more about the Peacebuilding Compared project in the book. What you won't read there, explicitly, is that the project is founded on a politics of hope. Its comparative lens suggests a world of possibilities for how conflict may be avoided, mitigated, and brought to an end. This first volume shows, paradoxically, how military actions can both fuel violence and help bring about its cessation. It shows how individual actions, whether by a president or diplomats of apparently lost causes, can make outstanding contributions to the future of their peoples and to the international community. It even suggests a way in which Swiss cheese can be exported to the Spice Islands, and in doing so, shows how we can all make a contribution to peace. But more on that from Professor John Braithwaite, founder of the Regulatory Institutions Network, or RegNet, at the ANU, Australian Research Council Federation Fellow, internationally recognised criminologist, and the leading investigator on the Peacebuilding Compared project. John.
Thanks, Mike. We do have a wonderful team with the Peacebuilding Compared project. We have this core team who have organised the infrastructure of the comparison between so many different places, and we have people like Mike and one or two others who I'll mention later on, who have made specific contributions because of their expertise on a particular case. In the case of Mike, that's West Papua, and being able to work with people like Mike, who has that depth of knowledge and concern about West Papua, and we have some people from West Papua in the audience. He's done a fantastic job with organising the Papua web, building a network of exchange of information between scholars and across civil society. This paper's about why East Timor won independence, Aceh won a successful peace agreement, and West Papua won neither. All three were conflicts that raged for decades, even more than a century in the case of Aceh, and all three of these conflicts spiked up in the late 1990s. Indonesia suffered an explosion of various kinds of violent conflict around the turn of the millennium. There was religious violence, ethnic violence, separatist violence, terrorism, violence by criminal gangs, by the security forces and militias. All of these problems have fallen dramatically since. Terrorism, for example, that was rising so sharply in Indonesia through the 90s and right up to the Bali bombing in 2002, has fallen dramatically since, in a period where, if you look at the terrorism databases, terrorism has been increasing. In fact, up to 2002, Indonesia was the country in the world that had the worst terrorism problem, quickly to be succeeded after 2002 by countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And unlike so many other predominantly Muslim countries that have had this sharp upward movement in the incidence of terrorism across the last decade, Indonesia is an exception in having a sharp decline in the amount of terrorism in the same period. So no Muslim nation has really been as successful as Indonesia on that front. And if you think about a phenomenon like Laskar Jihad, this was a group with an extremely radical ideology that swept into places such as Ambon and Poso, basically wiping out Christian villages, 2,000-3,000, maybe more of them sweeping in the case of Ambon. The accomplishment here was one of persuading these folk to return to their villages, often back in Java or Sulawesi, voluntarily. And that was accomplished through a process of dialogue, very much led by religious leaders, local religious leaders saying, on Ambon Island, for example, saying to the Laskar Jihad leadership, we appreciate the fact that you came over, but really your continuing presence is not helping us now. We want to be engaged with the peace process, and your returning would help the peace process. That, combined with bringing ulamas across from their own villages in Java, for example, to be part of the same process of religious persuasion. So that without violence, these guys were basically persuaded to put down their weapons, to return to their home villages, and Laskar Jihad basically no longer exists. Our book argues, and this was accomplished through a kind of reconciliatory peacemaking that I want to draw out a bit now. Our book argues that between 1997 and 2004, Indonesia experienced a period of what Emil Durkheim called anomie, a breakdown of the regulatory order that secures the institutional order, a collapse of the rules of the game. A security sector that pursued its own interests by taking sides instead of preventing violence from all sides was one important part of that wider problem of anomie. Anomie recurs as a problem in our next three cases of Peacebuilding Compared, cases beyond Indonesia. When the security sector began doing their job in a conflict like Ambon that I just mentioned, the conflict ended fairly quickly. So in Ambon, what you had was police and military, Indonesian police and military, engaging in massive firefights with each other because they had moved to different sides of the conflict. And when that ended, basically, the conflict ended. Stephen Wilkinson argues that there's abundant comparative evidence from many countries that shows that large-scale ethnic or religious rioting does not take place where a state's army or police deploys police fairly and firmly to stop it. Does this mean that our friends in the police could be justified in concluding that if only resources were focused on security sector reform, effectiveness in preventing conflict would be maximised? No. One problem with that prescription is that there are many reasons why the security sector fails to do its job. In our Indonesian cases and in East Timor, sometimes soldiers and police fail to stop violence because they wanted to support the winner and they really didn't know which side is going to win. Sometimes they move aside to allow civilians to be slaughtered because their commander has taken a bribe to look the other way. Sometimes they look the other way because the attacking forces are huge and they fear for their own safety. Sometimes rank and file soldiers join one side because of their own faith or political beliefs. Sometimes they fail to do their jobs because they're annoyed about being hungry and not getting their pay. Sometimes conflict between different factions within the military paralyses it. Sometimes they fail to protect civilians on one side because the political elite gives them clear signals that that elite wants this to end by the other side winning. Sometimes they fail to do their job because they want chaos on the streets to destabilise a government that they see as hostile to the military. In East Timor in 1999, the military wanted to destabilise the presidency of Mr Habibie, and indeed East Timor did end his presidency. Sometimes the military manages these tensions by delegating security to a militia, and then the militia gets out of hand to the point where the military can no longer control it. That was a big part of the East Timor story. But out-of-control militias have also been a problem in Aceh and West Papua. Because there are many reasons why security forces fail under pressure, it's best we limit the frequency with which they have to face down mobs throwing bombs. Western security forces look good in terms of their capacity to maintain domestic order only because they've never tried to stop a phalanx of 1,000 angry people carrying machetes and hurling the odd bomb. The argument is, why rely on a fallible last line of defence when earlier lines of social defence are available? Here we have the Swiss cheese that Mike foreshadowed. James Reason is the preeminent theorist of this way of thinking about risk. Redundant defence will not work if it has just any old strings to its bow. Very different kinds of strings are needed to cover the weak spots of one intervention with the strengths of another. Reason developed the Swiss cheese model in application to aircraft accident prevention. Different layers of control are needed to cover weak spots of one barrier with barriers that have different weak spots in different places, so that if you cover a pilot with a co-pilot or cover one computer with a backup computer, that's not as effective as covering a pilot with a computer or a computer with a pilot. Why? Because two pilots flying over snow at the same time might simultaneously suffer whiteout. Two computers can be attacked by the same virus at the same time. Societies should therefore, on this view, invest in resolving root causes of conflict, such as discrimination against an ethnic group, as well as proximate causes. And in addition, they need effective community policing that smothers sparks that could ignite conflict. As a last resort, they need the capacity to halt riots and the capacity to be able to outgun rampaging militias. The theory is that societies that are strong on all these capabilities are unlikely to experience a civil war. That view also means that UN peacekeepers can be an effective additional slice of cheese where a national security sector is suffering anomie. General Cosgrove's peacekeepers in East Timor illustrate. Suharto's Indonesia had been forged by the military. When his regime collapsed, there were various factions within the military. Some generals wanted the military to step back from its political role and submit to democratically elected leaders. Others wanted to destabilise the emerging Indonesian democracy and reassert political control by the military through physical intimidation. Others simply wanted to exploit the climate of instability to make money by demanding protection payments from frightened people or by selling weapons. There were even military snipers who sold their assassination skills to both sides in our Indonesian conflicts. Hence, it does not follow from our analysis that the efficient strategy for foiling conflict is simply to get the security sector working properly. Our narratives show that there are many reasons why the security sector fails to do its jobs, and sometimes these are more complex in their politics than the reasons for the conflict itself. Sometimes the security sector complexes are more complex than the politics of the societal conflict. Okay, so that without tackling the political problems that produce security sector anomie, there can be no guarantee that the security sector will work in nipping violent rioting in the bud before it escalates into civil war. Without grappling with the drivers of security sector grievance and greed, the peacemaker cannot count on the military police to control violence born of the grievance or greed of others. When the military or large factions within it share the same grievances as the rioters or seize entrepreneurial opportunities to make money out of the disorder, the military, far from supplying the solution, can become the largest part of the problem, and that's one of the big lessons of our Indonesian experience here. Timor-Leste secured independence and peaceful coexistence, even mutual respect with Indonesia. Aceh got a peace agreement that was not perfect and not perfectly implemented, but it seems a sustainable peace at this stage in Aceh as well. All the other Indonesian conflicts in the initial diagram more or less have had most of the heat taken out of them. Anomie subsided, a revised democratic dispensation of the rules of the game resettled. The predictions that Indonesia would break up like the former Yugoslavia did not materialise. An effective politics of reconciliation in which current President Yudhoyono was prominently involved in many of these cases was an important part of that. Our book argues that it was not truth and reconciliation as in South Africa. We describe it as non-truth and reconciliation. Now, if we think about a different case, Bougainville will be our second volume, and it's a reconciliation meeting that we attended during our fieldwork in 2006 or 2007. In these Bougainville reconciliation meetings, they were very much occasions of truth and reconciliation, where ultimately in a protracted process there would be people who would say to other people, I wish to accept responsibility for the killing of your son, for the rapes, the burning that occurred in your village. And really there were a lot of reconciliation meetings during the Indonesian conflicts that are listed on our initial map, where the structure of the meetings were not so different from these Bougainville meetings. But when I would say to people, well, would that situation that I've just described in Bougainville ever happen in this province of Indonesia, they would say, no one would ever step forward and say, I killed your brother. That's just not something that would happen at these events. So reconciliation, yes, but truth-speaking or grounded on truth, no. So what was the, how did these reconciliations that, we're wanting to argue here, did deliver some meaningful forms of peace in the last decade in Indonesia? How were they transacted? Well, through a great variety of bottom-up ways. So the institution of halal bi halal, which is a uniquely Indonesian institution where neighbours go next door and ask the neighbour to forgive them for anything terrible they've done to them in the last year. You often, you'll read in the Indonesian newspapers how this institution of halal bi halal has become a lot less meaningful. It's just ritualistic, and people don't mean it when that they really want forgiveness for the terrible things they've done to their next door neighbour over the past year. But actually, in the context of a lot of these horrible conflicts where there was killing, burning, rape going on, when they would hug and ask for forgiveness, there were tears and they were meaningful encounters about forgiveness, but not where the specificity of what forgiveness was being sought for was uttered by those who were responsible for the crime. And rituals of everyday life were important. The first occasion in the village, in the Muslim village that was driven out by their Christian neighbours, where Christians would go to a Muslim funeral in large numbers, or vice versa, would often become occasions for reconciliation between the two adjacent villages. Christians attending the celebrations for Muhammad's birthday and Muslims attending celebrations for Christmas and bringing gifts. One thing that happened in a number of the cases was where Christians had burnt down a mosque. They would try to persuade their Muslim fellow villagers to come back by showing, see, we mean it when we say we want reconciliation with you, because we are building the mosque and we'd like to work with you to finish it. And similarly, Muslims rebuilding a church that they had brought down, and this Indonesian idea of reconciliation through gotong royong, work together, shared work together, a practical shared project together that could lead to a concrete form of healing. So the way reconciliation delivered some of these positive outcomes was totally, this was a paper that I wrote in 2005, in the year when we started this work. And I regret to report to you, this was a model of truth and reconciliation, really based on the literature from the South African experience. Unfortunately, none out of our first 12 cases fit the model. The one that goes closest to it is Bougainville, but Bougainville doesn't have this bottom loop at all. So there, 9 out of 12 is a pretty good score for a social theorist. One might ask, why does one write social theory when you can get that kind of outcome? And of course, the answer is that was able to publish it in an ERA A-star journal, and that's all that matters, of course. Now, West Papua, as Mike was drawing to our attention, is the big exception to this positive story that has been told so far in my remarks. In 1999, 2000, in that period of heightened autonomy after the fall of Suharto and after the Asian financial crisis that triggered that, you had very similar developments in West Papua to those occurring in places like Aceh, and they didn't come to fruition in a moderately successful peace process in the way they did in a place like Aceh, because of two fundamental reasons. In West Papua, there was an agreement for special autonomy for West Papua that had a number of positive features in it, was certainly far short of what folk in the Free Papua movement wanted. But of course, that's always the case in a peace agreement. No side gets all of the things they want, but there were a lot of fairly major concessions by Indonesia, but the big problem was that what was promised in that package really wasn't delivered, and that was the number one main factor why the peace process in West Papua unravelled. The second one was that Kapassus assassinated Teis Alue, the leader of the independence movement in West Papua. So these two big setbacks occurred in this case. What we've had in West Papua is really 50 years of negative peace of a sort, for most of the last 50 years, not high levels of conflict occurring, but spiking up every now and then. It seems to us that that's a situation that doesn't, that kind of negative peace where for most of the time not a lot of people have been killed, but no positive peace has been achieved through through a peace dialogue that people have accepted as meaningful, really is either going to go in the direction of a major blow-up of the conflict at some time in the future, or in the direction of that credible peace process that a case like Aceh was able to have. And what we have in West Papua is kind of an unstable balance of force where we have militias, we have militias which are unarmed but could be armed, depending on someone being motivated to make that move, OPM and the Indonesian military in a kind of unstable balance of forces. A lot of some lines of commonality with East Timor here, in the sense that Rico Guterres, who was the best known militia leader in East Timor, has been hired as a consultant by the military leadership in West Papua about how to set up these kind of militias in that province. People, of realist dispensation will often say to us, nothing's going to come of this, in spite of this unsettled instability, because the Free Papua movement really don't have many of these weapons at all. They're not well organised, they don't have large numbers, and therefore they're not a credible security threat that we ought to worry about. Well, I remind you, if you think about Philantil in 1990, they were down to, according to Xanana Gusmau's testimony to the CAVR, their Truth and Reconciliation process in Timor, they were down in 1990 to fewer than 100 men and 35 weapons. And actually, OPM has a lot more than that at the moment, and they have a much better situation for fighting an insurgency. They have easier mountains, jungle to escape into. They have a border that they can flee across much more readily than Xanana Gusmau and his fighters were able to do, and they have done that successfully in the past of this spikes of this conflict. What happened is that Xanana moved away from that situation of great weakness in 1990 after the Santa Cruz massacre in 1991. The Santa Cruz massacre not only mobilised international concern about what was happening in East Timor, concern that had not been there before Santa Cruz, except in a fairly small East Timor solidarity movement. Santa Cruz also dramatically increased the joining of Xanana's forces in the hills, increased the number of successful efforts to secure weapons, and all fronts of that resistance grew. And that's why when we were doing our interviews among the most angry young men of the Free Papua movement in the highlands of West Papua, they would say, what we're going to do to re-energise the conflict is organise, confront, and we will have a super Santa Cruz that will do for us what Santa Cruz did for Xanana Gusmau. And the recent International Crisis Group report reported that they had been told the same thing in a number of their interviews. A difference between West Papua and Aceh and Timor is that in both Aceh and Timor, what you had was a kind of forthright presidential leadership to stand up to the military. So I'm now taking us back to that earlier part of the analysis about the military being a large part of the problem here. Now, for quite different reasons, Habibie stood up to the military in the case of East Timor, and President Yudhoyono stood up to the military in the case of Aceh. So you might say, well, why wouldn't President Yudhoyono do the same thing in the case of West Papua? And indeed, that's what we should hope might happen. That's what we should be pushing for diplomatically. But I suppose the simple answer is that politically within Indonesia, the military remains very important, and maybe he thinks to do what he did in Aceh, which was to eyeball his generals and say, if any of you derail this peace process, I will get rid of you from his positions. He's not willing to do that. In the case of West Papua, perhaps he's not willing to push his luck in that regard. But he was willing to push his luck in regard to Aceh and Timor, or the two presidents were, because there was a huge amount of international pressure for different reasons. In the case of Aceh, that was connected to the tsunami, and we're particularly talking about US pressure here, though Australia was not unimportant. And in the case of Timor, after Santa Cruz, there was the international solidarity movement really became quite strong and effective, and both Foreign Minister Downer and Prime Minister Howard came to the view that it would be good politics because of public opinion on both the right and the left in Australia. They made the political judgment that it would be good politics to change Australia's Jakarta First policy in respect of East Timor. Papua lacks that Indonesian presidential leadership. It lacks the international pressure to push the presidential leadership. Still, our ethical obligations as international citizens, we'd argue, is to contribute toward such international pressure. We Australians failed that test in Timor between 1975 and 1999 to our eternal shame. We failed it because of what our colleagues Hilary Charlesworth, Aderitu Suarez and I, in our fourth book of, when it's done, of Peacebuilding Compared, what we will call it in that book, the era of misplaced realism. It was the era of discounting idealist networking in politics. It was a failure to understand weapons of the weak, how and why the weak do often overthrow the strong in politics. And part of that was a failure to understand people power and the power of the crowd in history, as Georges Roudet called it. The power of the crowd at Santa Cruz in a most horrible way, and the power of the crowd of students on the streets of Jakarta, many of whom were East Timorese students supporting the democracy movement, the wider democracy movement for Indonesia. World leaders particularly underestimated the brilliance and resilience of the network diplomacy led by now President Ramos Horta, and of the clandestine movement of Fretland supporters inside Timor, in Java, in Bali, that were masterminded by Shanana Gusmao, and of which Aderitu was a prominent member, although I don't think he was saying that at the time when he was a student. We can understand peace in Timor as an accomplishment of a network analysis of power in which the Australian Solidarity Network played a noble role, a role that made the realist analysis that our government was committed to a tragic political error. In West Papua, Australian civil society is still failing the test it failed in Timor until 1999. That's not to say that there is any hope that Papua would turn out like Timor, but there is a hope it could turn out rather more like Aceh, with a legitimate, reasonably just peace that empowers Papuans within the framework of the Indonesian state. President Yudhoyono played a positive role in Aceh, as we've said, and in securing peace in other parts of Indonesia during the past decade. If he grasped the nettle of the church dialogue for Papua Land of Peace, he can be a great peacemaker in the history of his country. If President Obama were able to put him under a bit of pressure, maybe not that much pressure, but pressure that would enable President Yudhoyono to say to his military that the international realities are, I must nurture a new peace dialogue in Papua, then we may avoid Papua having the super Santa Cruz of which its young militants in the highlands speak. Thank you, and I should say that our other co-authors are, do you want to wave your hands, Leah? And they are very keen to sign copies of the book, but and we're very grateful to them, and very grateful to Mike for his contribution to the book that I've already said, and to Adorito and Hilary, and all of the forthcoming authors who will be joining us in this project. And I also want to single out both Leah and Kate, who is Leah's successors as the leaders of the coordination of the Peacebuilding Compared project. It is a project of crazy ambition, and it takes a Kate and it takes a Leah to do the difficult work of getting people like Valerie and I to work together. Thank you.